right. Good morning, Dr. Richards. How are you on this fine Sunday?
Good morning, Dr. Live. I'm doing all right. Tough Sixers loss last night that you saw, but how are you
Uh,
doing?
Doing all right. Surprisingly, wide awake now. So it was a lot of energy came out of that game last night. So, but a little deflating at the very end there.
Yeah, tough ending for sure. For sure.
All right. So today we're gonna continue to discuss the movement continuum and some of the factors that are involved in that. So we talked a couple podcasts back about the idea of the movement continuum starts with these positions and transitions that we try to understand, but we also have to assess them. And the way that we assess them is we look at four different markers of control. So we talked the last two podcasts about pain, which would be the first marker of control. Now, today we're going to talk about a second one, postural control. So postural control, there's a lot to talk about here because it's not simple. This is where I think the eye of the clinician and the experience of the clinician really comes in, because it isn't really black and white. There's a lot to be able to assess and kind of use your expertise to figure out what works best for the individual and what becomes the standards that we're trying to set when it comes to posture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and where's your head really go initially when you're thinking about postural control?
So I guess a standard that I'll often use is head over rib cage over pelvis. And it depends on the position that we're starting in. So that could be a vertical alignment. That could be more of a diagonal alignment as we're trying to kind of hinge forward or do different positions from there. Or if we're lying on, in supine or prone position, it could be more of a horizontal alignment. But that's a starting point, and one of the reasons that I'll use that as a starting point is it tends to be something that gives the airway theoretically the most space, right? So it can make people have the best performance from a standpoint as they can breathe better there. And we'll talk about breath control and thinking about the different areas that we want to focus on anatomically for trying to optimize a good expansive inhale versus a more compressive inhale towards midline. A lot of times the positioning of the head and rib cage and pelvis really matter to give us the ability to optimize or balance a good breath, which then allows us to optimize pressure throughout the body. To be clear, it's just a standard. There's a lot of reasons where I won't be that picky with someone's initial posture, but I'll just sort of look at what are they presenting with, as far as like where it's easiest for them to get with the movement I'm asking them to do. And then I just want to see if from their starting point, when they go in transition, do they really go away from that initial starting point at the head, at the rib cage, at the pelvis, right? So I think there's sort of, you set a certain standard. Is it what they're showing you acceptable? Is it safe? And then when you watch them move, are they directing the movement in the most efficient way that they can do? And if not, it becomes pretty obvious that what tends to happen is you see, say someone's doing a squat, right? You want the idea of the squat to be a vertical direction as much as possible. Somebody's, let's say, not even a squat, but just getting up from a chair. Someone's sitting on a chair. Ideally, they're getting to standing. That's a vertical posture. So if they have to get to standing by really bowing forward, lifting their butt, dropping their head to get back up to a vertical position, that's pretty inefficient. Now, that might be the only way someone can start doing that at first, but our goal is over time to say they're losing postural control by going away from the direction that they're trying to attain. So we want to, over time, make that closer to that efficient direction. So that's the broadest way that I like to think about it. So there's a lot of wiggle room in there based on somebody's pain or someone's starting point of what joints they might have to work around, and where we are in the process. If we're just getting someone moving for the first time, I'm not really going to be too picky with postural control. I'm just going to make the exercise safe enough that they have a large buffer zone for going outside of ideal posture.
Mm-hmm. So it kind of sounds like posture you're looking at both statically and dynamically in terms of the ability to maintain positions as well as transition into and out of certain positions efficiently.
Absolutely. So, from the static perspective, I may take a broad look at someone's functional movement. So again, we could use the sit to stand as an example, and you see, that there is some inefficiencies there. It doesn't mean that you don't want to train that, because there might just be a need to get them doing the action more, make errors, make safe errors so that they can actually figure out a more efficient path. But then you can slow the movement down into the bottom position and the top position, right? Just so that there's an understanding of what that bottom position feels like a preparation for standing. A lot of times that helps people. So if I want somebody to stand more vertically, I might teach them where to put their feet, what to do with their midline. I might just give them a cue for their center. And then with their arms, maybe I'll have them reach a little bit more vertically, because it's a guide for the direction to have them go. And then we also want to adjust the seat. So if the position is too hard, if it's too low, even though that might be where they feel like a normal chair position is, or what they have to get up in training, I might make it a little bit easier by elevating the seat and say, all right, now try to stand up more vertically, without losing position down towards a more horizontal. And usually that works well. So it just gives some success to feel, okay, this is what we're going for. Eventually we're going to bring this seat down, and you want to have that same direction of motion, with things getting progressively harder over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like that point. I think statically, how I normally think of it is really in line with what you were saying: skull over shoulders, over rib cage, over pelvis. And I really like the term. I think it was Pat Davidson talked about in his seminar. He calls it sagittal competency.
Right.
Just really in that plane, like, can you be really centered over, if you're standing up, over your midfoot essentially?
Right.
And a lot of people, I think, we come in and have a tendency to not necessarily be centered over their foot, and that's not necessarily good or bad, but it just shows us kind of how they're orienting their body in space, and potentially what interventions we might want to start with, or bias, kind of like you said, like having them reach in certain directions, or changing the exercise constraints by elevating a foot, or elevating the chair, or something along those lines, to help them kind of move in the direction that we deem they need to move. And I think another, more, I guess, is a little bit more down the rabbit hole of that, is this term of frontal competency, or this concept of that, where we're thinking about your ability to lateralize, which is something that we do every step we take. And
Right.
I think this was really originally made popular from Postural Restoration Institute, talking about some of these concepts. But your ability really to line up your center of mass, or your nose, belly button, knee, and toe on one side, all in a line. And I think that can tell us a lot about balance as well, and your ability to just really shift efficiently side to side, which is something we do every step we take. So I like thinking about it in terms of the gait cycle, and that's kind of, I think, where my bias has been in the past with some of my personal learning and interest. But I think it transfers over to everything we've talked about in the past, whether it's functional activities or very specific weight room activities. So that's kind of where my head goes initially. But I think within those weight room activities, there's always this talk of creating torque, irradiation, and these concepts. And what do you think about that? Sort of, how do you cue things like that? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think with irradiation, bracing, torquing, a lot of times these terms are used if in a strength setting, but they can be sort of dialed up or dialed down depending on what we're looking at, and I guess what the challenge is for the individual. So irradiation is just the idea. It's a neurological term, an old neurological term, I think, from Sherrington back in the early 1900s. But it's really just that you can create, if you're trying to create force in one muscle, you can irradiate that to other muscles in the body, right? So you can take the contraction in one area and spread it to another area of the body. So if you were doing a single arm exercise, let's say a single arm press, where you're trying to press a heavy weight overhead, to just focus on the arm that you're using would make you a lot weaker than if you thought about your whole body. So if you make a fist, on the other hand, you try to engage your center, you engage your glutes, you engage your legs, you try to co-contract every muscle in your body, you're going to create this neurological charge where you're just going to facilitate more strength throughout your whole body. So I think irradiation is something that is quite useful to be able to do and to be able to understand. And then you can back it off depending on the task at hand. So you don't always want to have 100% irradiation throughout your whole body if you're just trying to get up from a chair. But for some people, like teaching them that idea of connecting the body as a whole can really be useful to have them take stress off of areas that would normally be painful for them. So again, we'll use the squat example. If someone's got knee pain standing up, while teaching them to create a little bit of irradiation where they're using their abs, their glutes, they're pushing through their feet, maybe even making gentle fists as they go and do a sit to stand. It teaches them this concept, like you're stronger than you think getting up from there, and you feel more of your body. You're dispersing the load through your body a bit better. So there's a postural control element to that where you're going to be less likely to move out of the line that you're trying to move. So a very common compensation for getting up from a chair is the knees buckle in, the spine tends to flex forward. So if you start with a little bit more irradiation, your body is going to be more likely to stay in the line that you want to, because you have muscles working on kind of both sides of each joint, ideally to try to have you just move in the direction that you're trying to move. So irradiation is like a really broad concept. And then we can take things like torque, which would be, all right, we'll say the feet are on the ground in this scenario. Maybe I'm going to try to create this idea of screwing my feet through the ground, which gives me a little bit of a cue towards external rotation at the hips. And that'll give my hips a little pre-tension to go in the opposite direction of my knees wanting to fall in. And that's just one example. But a lot of times what you'll see is when things get heavy and get hard, the body might want to crumble towards midline, right? It might want to flex. And this is the same thing at the shoulders and at the hips. So we might want to go towards internal rotation or flex towards midline. Think about someone trying to lift a heavy bar off the ground, and the bar is going to want to stay on the ground. You're going to want to extend up into a more upright position. So ideally, you're trying to break the bar, create torque on the bar, which then creates this motion of keeping your shoulders away from that midline collapse. So it's sort of like you're countering the compensation, or you're countering the thing that the weight, and sometimes that's just the weight of gravity, wants to do to you. So that's the way I think about a lot of these cues. And then, I'm glad you brought up the lateralization, because I'd say like in the last 5 to 10 years of my career, that's probably one of the biggest things to think about. Like we learned about posture and just sort of randomly, generally, the idea it's head, about the head over shoulders over hips, but it's always thought of in sort of this bilateral sense, or this not even bilateral, but just this sort of single entity, like head, one rib cage, one pelvis. But when we start thinking about movements that are more reciprocal, which is a lot of movements that we do when we're moving forward, we do have to think of the body as almost like two halves, where there's a posture on one side and a posture on the other side. And the idea of teaching the ability to shift postural control from one side to the other is super valuable and super difficult for a lot of people. So I love that the cueing of nose, over knee, over middle of the foot, depending on the action they're trying to get people in. But it's difficult, but you can get people there, even people that aren't athletic, and they really gain a lot from that. So gait is one of the best places to start with that idea, but it could be something as simple as just having people stand in a staggered stance and try to feel their body shift to one side more than the other, which really helps balance over time. It really helps this idea of, okay, I'm just feeling pain on one side of my body more than the other. Well, where are you unable to shift weight? And a lot of times just this idea of lateralization helps people understand, one, that they might be really overusing one side more than the other, and that's going to become a subconscious thing over time. So having these drills to really feel the difference between, can we lateralize to one side more than the other, becomes super valuable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's kind of like that to me is a little bit different of a route than creating torque, where it's like you're trying to
Hmm.
really create all of this force into one real direction in an effort to actually create more tension and move either yourself or some type of load or perform some sort of exertional activity to some extent. Like we can dial that knob up or down
Hmm.
efficiently versus I think it's like there's a time where you want to do that, and then there's a time to kind of be able to relax into certain postures and actually kind of go with things. And I think usually when I'm using some type of lateralization drill, whatever it is, it's kind of like you're moving, things are almost moving more inwards, or your body is moving more laterally over a foot. So it's
Yeah.
like the net is, your midline is lined up with the inside of one of your legs. So
Right.
it's a little bit different than a bilateral movement. And that's where I think it's important to kind of be able to change states
Yeah.
and go from one to the other. And that just shows that, this person in front of us has this dynamic ability to actually assume these different positions and be comfortable and strong in them. And I think that's one of the best ways to think about, we talk about good versus bad posture would be really this ability to kind of transition between different states effectively.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think when we talk about torquing, or we can even just think of this as sort of a continuum of how we would want to use our hands and our feet, and just the tension in our body. If we have our feet on the ground, and or we have our hands on the ground or hands on an object, we can think about having four quadrants in the hands and the feet, right? So you think, well, the foot will make the most sense, where you have the ball of the foot, there's the inside and outside corners, and then the heel, there's the inside and the outside corners. So if we were going to create the most torque through the ground, and this would not be necessarily the most useful functionally, but just to create the most force into torque, a lot of times what is going to happen is we're going to bias the outer corners of the feet, and we're going to create this supination external rotation moment, like in all the joints of the lower body. So hips are going to go to external rotation, but we'll also really go to the outside of the feet. Well, that becomes really problematic. That might be useful at first to really lock in a lot of tension, but eventually we're going to need that inside part of the foot depending on the movement that we're doing. If we're just trying to hold our ground and be as rigid as possible, then that's going to be the strategy, right? But with movement, you usually need a little bit of ebb and flow, right? And as we start to go into, so let's use a deadlift as an example. As we go down for the bar and we hinge down, we may need to create a little bit more of a sense of supination to get down through there. But as we're pushing up through the ground, we may want more of that inside part of the foot. We might want to zip up through the inside part of the thighs. So that's going to be more biasing towards pronation. So we're going to need both sides of the foot. Therefore, and that will give us some reference that we're using both sides of the joints up into the hips too. So there's this idea of it really depends on how much force we need. And then when we're doing something like lateralizing, we have to know, do we want to bias the body more towards, say, hip external rotation, supination, or pronation, and having that sense of the references in the feet. And we can do the same thing in the hands, where the pinky side of the hand may correspond more to a supination or external rotation bias. The thumb side of the hand may bias us more towards an internal rotation or pronation bias. That's really helpful to know. And that's why there's not a right posture, but it really depends on what we're trying to create from a movement standpoint, or what we're trying to counter from a compensation standpoint. I think that that's really important as well.
The hands and feet are so big because they're
Mm-hmm.
the real things that interact with our space around us the most,
Yeah.
at least like physically. Obviously, we're
Mm-hmm.
looking at things and um but I think I've found, and you've probably found the same thing, just that sometimes cueing the foot pressures or cueing hand pressures tends to actually make a movement look a lot better or worse, depending on
Right, right.
our cues if we do
Yeah.
it well, but without actually having to create much thought process internally for the person as to what's going on. If you're doing some type of bench press or something with your upper body, like what's going on at the wrists, at the elbows, at the shoulders, all of that. It kind of cleans a lot up. And I think that's beneficial in terms of just keeping clients to a certain extent from having to think too much about what's going on, and really instead be able to focus on executing the movement. Now, obviously, there's a time to be really internalized with what's going on in a movement, but if the goal is to move some weight or just, learning a movement, I think it's so helpful and so big, and carries back to the gait cycle as well, especially with the feet.
Absolutely. And I think it's one of the more valuable cues that you can give somebody to just teach them how to shift weight, right? Because that's a lot of times when we're doing weight bearing exercises that might provoke symptoms. It's a weight shifting game, right? So if someone's got front knee pain, just teaching them what the back of the foot feels like can be very useful. Most of the time, symptoms are unilateral too. So if someone's got a right-sided knee pain more on the outside, teaching them what the inside of the right foot feels like, but also what the outside of the left foot feels like, in the movement that they're actually getting the symptoms, is usually one of the more powerful things you can do. Now, you need some focus with that at first, right? So it's what's hard is to try to just to give them the advice and not give them a drill to help them feel it, right? Like, so that you need to slow things down so that there is actually a building of these proprioceptive cues. But that could be one of the best places to start, is just, okay, like feel these contact points in your feet. And that's an exercise, right? It could be an exercise without it being more complex. Like, you don't have to put it into a movement right away. It could just be, just getting them more in tune with those sensations in the body. And then you connect other dots. All right. So here, this outer part of your foot can now correspond with your body lateralizing to that side a little bit more. Well, this inside part of the foot is you coming off of that side, right? So now, does that make sense that it would offload some of that knee pain that you're getting, right? So this is where you start to connect symptoms and pain with some of these postural cues, to try to, just either share the load or offload the area that's taking too much stress.
Fully agree. What, when you, I guess, are thinking of, we talked a little bit about earlier, like good versus bad posture. What are you defining as good, or what is bad, or does that even exist?
I don't think it exists, and I think it's one of the most controversial areas in rehab and fitness. Because when nowadays you're getting a lot of research that shows that there's really no association to posture and pain, which that doesn't actually surprise me. But that doesn't mean that when you change somebody's posture when they're in pain, that it won't help to take their pain away, right? So like it doesn't necessarily work in the inverse, but just to say, okay, your posture is going to be the cause of your pain, that's overly simplistic, right? And that's not gonna, I'm not surprised that that doesn't show up in research. But we know as therapists that are working with people who are actively in pain in the moment, just a change of their position will change their pain, right? So I think a lot of times you're going to base what your standard is, and standard doesn't mean good or bad, but you're going to base it on your body of norms as a clinician, for one, where you saw like, okay, this position seemed to actually minimize pain when pain was active. So now that's going to be my starting point, because I've seen more people present with pain or feel pain as their body started to move into this posture or move away from that posture. So I think that's a typical starting point. But then it's also, it might just be sort of somewhere, a position that's in the middle, right? As a starting point where we're not too extended, we're not too flexed, right? So it's just like a balanced point, quote unquote. And we don't have to hold on to that firmly. Like, we just have a standard, because if you don't have a standard, then you are not assessing anything, right? Like it's just like it's chaos. It's the wild, wild west. You're just like, man, do what you want, right? So there's always a bigger prioritization model going on in your head too, right? So posture, to me, comes certainly after pain, pain provocation. But it also might come even a little bit after, just get people moving, right? If like moving in a non-fearful way. So I don't want people to get too internalized too soon about postural cueing. I want to get them doing movements that they're safe with, in that they actually deem it as safe. Like that's more
Yeah.
important to me than my eyes saying, oh, that doesn't look safe, because their posture is not ideal at the moment. If they feel comfortable with it, sometimes me telling them they're not doing it right is making it worse. It's giving them more
Yeah.
fear around the things. I just want to get them moving. So good posture, or even the postural standards that I'm looking for, are going to be secondary to getting people moving generally. So obviously it depends on what your clientele is, right? So if you're working with a higher level athlete, like you may want to start earlier on making some adjustments to technique, because they're doing higher level stuff, but they're probably more willing to take on some of that advice because they're looking to gain any advantage that they can. So they may be willing to have that conversation too of the why is this the standard? And I think that's always a good thing, when we can not just tell people what to do, but have a conversation about like what you're thinking as a clinician, and being able to maybe meet in the middle for, okay, this is what my body just feels like it can do right now. Is that safe enough? And going from there. But I think a lot of times trainers and therapists, they get like really in the weeds with the technique at
Mhm.
first, and because there's this mentality of, I'm going to hurt someone if I don't make this, like, oh, that's so unsafe. Well, it's actually not proven to be unsafe.
Yeah.
It's just going to be maybe an inefficiency that over time you're looking to clean up, because it'll make them be able to do harder things better.
I think that's like one of the best ways to put it too, is not saying it's unsafe, but just, hey, if we clean this thing up, you might be able to actually lift more, like you're going to be
Yeah.
stronger. This is just going to give you a better runway and it's going to be more efficient for you.
Yeah.
And just leave the like unsafe part out of the conversation. I think that's one of the biggest kind of points of nocebos in
Mm-hmm.
like the physical therapy world, is it's like, oh, you're doing a traditional shoulder exercise would be like an IYT sort
Mm-hmm.
of combo. And it's like, oh, your shoulder is elevating this centimeter. That's going to give you, you know, cervical radiculopathy. Like now that's obviously really taken too far by me there,
Mm-hmm.
but it's
Yeah,
sort of
it
along
happens.
those themes where it's just like if things are just a little bit off, then people freak out. And I think it's so true that in the research, there's nothing really backing up that these techniques are safe or unsafe. It's just I guess through probably personal anecdotes over
Mm-hmm.
time, been taught that. But I think it's, the deadlift is one of the best examples of people tend to be pretty scared of that with their back,
Yeah.
and that rounding your back is inherently dangerous and bad, and it shifts the load to your discs and the ligaments and everything. But it seems like the research is actually pointing to the fact that that's not really necessarily the case. It's not really any more dangerous necessarily than lifting with a quote neutral spine or more of a stacked position. Um, but I mean, you may have a longer runway trying to lift, at least for the most part, with more of that stacked position.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure you feel it, and I feel it when we're actually doing some hard work, right? There's a feeling of loss of position, like the position that you have a certain style in which you might deadlift, and saying, okay, this is my goal of how I want to move this bar right now. All right. And at 335, you can move it much cleaner than you can at 405. Right.
mhm.
And there's a difference in that sensation there, but the fight for position, I think, is really important.
Yeah,
And they, versus, okay, I have a totally different strategy for the way I'm going to lift this weight just because it's heavier. Like usually that's not the case for people, that
yeah,
they're kind of going in and thinking, okay, I'm going to lift the light bar in a different manner than
yeah,
the heavy bar. It's just that the weight will knock you out of position, and the fight for position still, that's what strength is, right? Like it keeps you safe in a way, because you're strong enough, even if from the outside it looks like you changed your shape, you're fighting for that posture, right? So, and I think that gets underestimated too, when people will just kind of look at something. Most people, if you watch, the strongest man in the world, you watch powerlifting, when they start to lift really heavy, I mean, their bodies are fighting for that position, but they're not staying perfectly in some type of ideal alignment. They're fighting for it, and they're doing it well. And part of strength is it gives you a buffer zone
Yep.
to do harder things, right? So in the training, place, you're doing way harder things than you would hopefully do in daily life, so that you actually do have, if I can lift 400 pounds, then most of my day I'm not going to face anything that's heavier than 50 pounds. Like I can do that in a lot of different ways and be really, really safe with it, right? So that's part of the strength idea, is that you just get this buffer zone of not having to be so worried about posture.
Yeah, and sometimes losing that, form that you would have when things are lighter, and things kind of change a little bit when you get heavier. And as you said, it's more from the outside eye, it looks like the body is changing, but the internal process, you're
Yeah.
still thinking the same thing. But I think that makes us so much more resilient in the long run too. Like
Mm-hmm.
if we give ourselves more of this bandwidth of ability to move, then we're just going to be better equipped and probably feel more comfortable and confident in different positions and not feel like every time we go to pick up I'm looking at a textbook right now, a textbook off the ground, like we don't have to like squat down, keep our body completely, straight or whatever it
Right.
is to do it. And I think there's a real mental, like a powerful sort of dose of confidence there of just actually feeling like, okay, I can handle, whatever's thrown my way.
Absolutely. And I think that speaks to movement variability, and postural variability, right? So if you have several movements in your repertoire, you don't have to like make a textbook lift look like a barbell deadlift, right? But
Yeah.
you may have still some reference for position. So you might go to one leg to pick that up. Like you may be able to, lateralize yourself. You may be able to drop down into a knee to pick it up, right? So, and there's a
Yeah.
different posture, and there'll be different postural cues that might be more optimal for all of these different, variable actions. So I think that's another part of just, taking a step back and not just looking at like one movement as king. Like how am I supposed to lift things from the ground? Well, there's a ton of ways you can lift things from the ground. It doesn't have to
Yeah.
be one way. And if there is one way, you're in a much worse place than if you can lift it in multiple ways, right? So
Yeah.
that's movement variability, and that's really, I think that's pretty well studied within the research from athletes, as far as I know too, is that the best athletes can do the thing they want to do in many different angles, right? Like,
Yep.
so that there's not like a perfect technique. Now there might end up being a sequence that they all return to,
Yeah.
but a golfer can have one leg, on up way higher than another leg. They could have, their body have to be turned, but they eventually get to the same sequence before making contact with the ball. Same thing with a basketball player, right? They can be facing away from the basket and not look at the basket, and eventually they'll end up in the position they want to be in right before they release the ball. But they have so many different ways in which they can get their body in that position. So there are no straight lines in athletics, if you will. There are some, but like that's not the intention. It's to figure out, how many different ways can I get to the task at hand. So I think function should be that way too, but
Yeah.
we can then break it down into, the different attributes that we're trying to gain that make life easier. And there's a ton of different postures that come in there. So that's why it's really one of the triggers. Now I get a couple triggers when I hear people saying things like, one of them is, talking about their diagnosis, that because of my diagnosis, this is why I'm, inevitably going to have pain. The other one becomes now is, I just have to have good form. It's, like I'm going to all these people and they're just not practicing good form, and I'm just like, I don't know what that means anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I understand the thought process, because certainly my mentality has evolved over the years on the idea of good technique. But it doesn't really exist like if you actually ask enough questions, right?
Yeah.
Because it really is so, person dependent or situation dependent.
Yeah. Yeah. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think this is it's a topic that's a bit controversial. And when you even look at it as a clinician to assess, it's hard to really document it as a very objective thing. But I do think it's important. You need that standard to what you're looking for, and just to say that it even becomes a baseline to say that people are able to move closer to the standard that they
Yeah,
weren't able to do initially, right? That just shows some objective movement progress, but
yeah,
you have to get people moving before they're able to do the perfect standard, right? And I
yeah,
think that's important to understand too. Like we're talking about motor learning most of the time when we're getting people moving
yeah,
and getting them to do things you want to do. So the best way to learn something is to actually make errors. I just heard a podcast that sort of
yeah,
reiterated this, and it was you want to make a lot of errors in a shorter amount of time, and that's the quickest way to learn something, right? So that means you can't be perfect, you shouldn't be perfect, but there needs to be a safety buffer, right? So if somebody is doing something that's like brand new to them, well, then maybe we have a little bit more of a conversation about like let's keep your positioning as ideal as possible. But if something is or even if it's brand new, but we want to make it easier than it otherwise would be. Like so we don't want to take them to
yeah,
their limits too early on. We do that for people that are more experienced in the action that they're trying to do.
yeah, absolutely.
All right. Anything else to add to this topic? I think that's pretty well covers what I wanted to say on it.
Yeah, no, that covers everything I wanted. So
And then next week, I think we're going to talk about breath control, which will really go hand in hand with this topic, because as we talk about the breath, we can talk about how to create intra-abdominal pressure, just try to optimize pressure in the body, and that absolutely goes hand in hand with being able to maintain postural control, to create things like core bracing, but even to optimize the idea of irradiation. We have to be able to connect that to our breath control. So that'll be for next week.
looking forward to it.
All right. See you then.